going to replace this alternator, which is a 70 amp alternator with a 90 amp alternator. That's a Mitsubishi style alternator that's on there, but this October 2023 was the last meet at Gaydon Motor Museum, and I came back in the dark, and I noticed when I'd got everything on, because it was raining as well, including my spotlights or driving lights, I was charging at less than 12 volts. And so I decided that I would upgrade the alternator to this one. Which should be a direct replacement for the one that's on there. It's the Mitsubishi style alternator. Alternator, where the one I think that's on there now is an older one. It was on when I bought the car, but this one is the higher rated 90 amp. So hopefully when I run everything in the car, and maybe including the air conditioning when I fix that, then this 90 amp alternator will cope with all of that without a problem. If you look carefully, the belts are skewed. I had a look at this before when I first got the car, and I don't know what I'm going to do about it. But if you put that on there, the distance, if you like, there, it's different to the distance there. It's as if the alternator ought to be a centimetre or so further back towards the engine. I think. And this car came with this alternator already on it. I think when you look carefully, one of the problems was the proximity down here of the connections to the engine block, but also the proximity of the unit itself to the block. There's only a small gap, but I've driven a good few miles with the belt like this, and it's been like this when I got the car, this skewed arrangement, and it doesn't appear to have suffered at all. I'm going to live with that slightly skewed belt arrangement. That bolt goes through, and there's a nut there, so obviously it acts as a spacer as well as that spacer, and then here that bolt goes all the way through into the cylinder head with another spacer just there. Now what I have is this stainless steel alternator bracket, which allows for easy adjustment with a 1/2 inch bolt through it into the alternator. And what I have here is it's a 30mm nut connection to this main power lead that did have a cap that went over the top, but that was secured with a cable tie, and that's just fallen off somewhere. You do need to protect that with a cap because of its close proximity to the head. What is on here, this connection on this side, is a plastic protecting piece so that this ring connector does not come into contact with the body of the alternator. And I might have to use this one on the new alternator. You can see the plastic body there of this one, and the way it all bolts together so that the connection here does not touch the body of the alternator. And I suspect this bit here was originally modified by just cutting this extra cap off. It's all about reducing this dimension so that it doesn't come into contact with the cylinder head. So that's the piece that comes off the new alternator, and all that's happened with the piece that's already on this adapted alternator is this cap piece has been cut off, so it's flush. I've taken various dimensions of this caliper of my old alternator compared to the new one, and unsurprisingly they're all exactly the same. So I need to reduce that bolt that takes the power to the same dimension as that bolt, so I need to cut off a piece off there, and then it should all match up nicely. If you also look carefully, you can see how this bracket has been bent backwards to facilitate the connection of the alternator. So when this is fitted, what you have is this spacer at the back. I suspect that's original because it fits so perfectly over that bolt. But I don't know what the original arrangement was. That bolt is a 3/8 diameter bolt. With the Mitsubishi alternator, the gaps here, and obviously here as you buy it, those hole diameters are too big. So what they've done is they've taken, this is an aluminium nut, and they've cut through with a 3/8 drill bit, and then they've filed down the thread on this one so that it fits inside that spacer, which comes with the alternator. This bit here, it's a similar piece that they've got. Again, I would imagine off another one of those aluminium nuts. That fits in there, and that gives it the stability it needs. And then they've got a spacer which goes in here, and that allows for the bracket, the bent bracket, if you look on the car, to slot in that space. Looking at the replacement alternator, this spacer comes out the back, and I need to knock it through. You may not need to do any of this. You could just decide on your own spacer sizing, but given that I think that's probably original, it wants to be up against the edge there. So I need to knock that through, and I had thought that I'd put a different spacer in there and make it look a lot better, but in reality, to get those inserts, two of those inserts and the correct spacer for the 3/8 of an inch diameter internal hole, and a sufficiently thick, basically a big one of these. It's quite hard to get spacers of that size, one that would fit and take up that bolt head, and that would look nice. But I think it was more aesthetics than anything else, so I'm just going to transfer the whole lot over to here. With it transferred over and that spacer knocked through, that's what it looks like. I've cut the thread on this so that it's much shorter, and I'll see about putting that on the car now. These are the electrical connections. Just coming through there, that's the plastic protector to stop the nut and the lead coming into contact with the outside casing of the alternator. Steve had suggested that one option was to install something like that, a spark plug boot or a right angle boot off the distributor of some cars. Install that on there, because you also need to protect that nut and the cable because it is so close to the engine block. I'm going to go down a different route. I've taken a piece of water piping I've split the piping. I will cable tie that in place, and then this whole unit should sit inside there. So with it in place like that, I'm hopeful that the nut that goes on the top there, and that will be ample protection because it extends quite a way over the nut. So I've put on the leads and one of those nuts that came with this alternator. So that's that style of nut. And hopefully there'll be enough room when I've put this tube over that nut to protect it from contact with anything else. I've put 2 cable ties on, and as you can see in there, that's where the nut is. Let's see if we can get this on. I've got the alternator on, including the cover, and there does seem to be sufficient clearance between the engine and the electrics. But if you can see that, there is plenty of gap between that main lead and the engine block. So I'll finish putting the belts back on and doing it up.